Good morning. Happy Sunday. Here we are again. Welcome to online church. It's good to be with you again and just to be able to worship in your house and in your living room. Let's pray and let's sing. Lord God, we thank you for your goodness. God, we thank you for your faithfulness. God, we thank you for your sovereign hand upon our lives, upon our homes, upon our families, upon our work. God, you are the one in charge. God, you are the way maker where there is no way. And we just pray that we would celebrate that this morning, that we would be able to sing and clap and rejoice because of who you are and who you created us to be. God, we love you. Bless this time of worship and teaching. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Hosanna, oh, oh, Hosanna. Praise the I worship you. I worship you. Yes, you are here, working in this place. I worship you. I worship you. Yes, you are here, moving in our midst. I worship you. I worship you.
Church. We are so glad to be with you this morning. Thank you for joining us. We are excited to continue on in our series, The Nuclear Family. But, wait just one moment. Hold on. Oh, wait. Don't you hate waiting? The truth is, none of us really like to wait. Whether it's waiting in line at the grocery store, waiting for that surprise, waiting for that grade, waiting for this pandemic to be over. There's a lot of waiting in life.
A lot of waiting, especially nowadays.
The truth is, if I would have had you wait just a little bit longer, I might have kind of annoyed you. Waiting is hard.
It is.
Even for the little things. Today we're going to talk about what it's like when we wait for the big things, when there's something that we can't do anything about, and God just says, wait.
So there are some God-sized challenges that come up in our life. You know, these kind of things that we can't even really take action on. There are some things that come up that we just have no control over, and they happen. And they're realities in our lives. And today, we're going to come up on a story where Sarai has one of those God-sized challenges. So, we're going to ask some questions here. What are we going to do about in our lives when we come up to those God-sized challenges? Sarai has one response, and we're going to try to push into maybe a slightly different response. Now, this story is conjoined to the story that we had already been talking about, and that is in Genesis chapter 16. We had talked about the story of Abram and Hagar and Sarai. Now, last week we looked at the story from Hagar's perspective. This week we're going to look at it primarily from Sarai's perspective. Last week we learned that God was doing some things in Hagar's life to set her up almost so that she could hear him. Even in the midst of her crisis. God's doing some of those similar things with Sarai, but from a much different angle. Because Sarai's got to come to grips with her own God-sized challenges, and I hope this week that we can kind of wrestle with our own God-sized challenges.
Let's remember it's been 10 long years. 10 years since God told Abram and made a promise, you will have a son, and not only one son, but you will have a multitude of sons and nations. We also have to remember that God made that promise to Abram, but nowhere do we see God speak that promise to Sarai. Sarai's inclusion in that promise is based purely on faith and assumption. But after 10 long years of waiting and 10 long years of not bearing a child, it would be easy to doubt. Easy to doubt the promise, easy to doubt her role in the promise.
So we are going to look at their situation here. And why did they make this decision? So in the story, Sarai says to Abram, they were promised a descendants, Abram was, as part of the covenant with this one true God. And it would be natural to think, well, that's going to come through Abram's wife. Well, 10 years, and they didn't have the child. And so Sarai concocts an idea. She says, hey, Abram, why don't you go take my slave, my servant, Hagar, who they got in Egypt. We remember that story a little bit. And why don't you sleep with her and let her provide the heir that I'm obviously not able to provide. And that's what happened. It was successful in that Hagar got pregnant, and then things really went awry. There was separation and there were problems. God met Hagar, and then Hagar came back into the family. But Sarai's part of this, we look back at this whole setup culturally and go, oh, that's awkward. Like, when would we possibly do that? Like, you would never say to me if we weren't able to have kids, hey, go find another woman, go make a baby with her, and then I will raise that baby as mine. I mean, that's just not really done much in our culture these days, and it feels awkward. So we're going to ask a few questions. Like, do we think that Sarai and Abram were confused about God's design for marriage and parenting?
No. Abram and Sarai had access, had heard the garden narrative. And within the garden narrative, what we're talking about is the creation story in Genesis. And we know from the garden narrative, God's design is laid out for marriage and for parenting. It is laid out as one man, one woman, reflective of God's image, equal allies for life. This has been passed down to them orally, but it has been passed down. This is God's design. The second question we'd ask is, were Sarai and Abram unclear on God's vision for their family?
And, well, we could say, well, maybe they were unclear, right? That we know that it was through Abram's offspring that they were going to have descendants and that they were going to bless the world. And this was going to happen through Abram's offspring. And we could definitely ask the question then, well, if it was through Abram, did it have to go through Sarai? And that's probably what she was thinking to some degree when she was talking about this whole Hagar plan. But we kind of got to go back to the garden. There was no such thing as, Adam, Eve, and Jenny. There wasn't 3 people there. There was only 2. And the pattern was set up. One man, one woman, allies for life. So what had happened is Sarai grabbed a piece of the culture around them. That this was common at the time for a prominent couple, especially a noble couple, to take a slave, to have a baby through that concubine, is what she ended up being, and then raising it as their own. Well, that is not God's design. That was the culture's design. And this is a little bit what happens when we start to give into the culture around us that doesn't reflect God's design for the world. Is we start to make up things on our own that are really apart from God, even if they're really consistent with culture. And that's very dangerous. But I kind of think that Abram understood what the vision was for his family. He just kind of let his wife overrun what he knew to be right.
Yes, this was culture's way of solving a problem, of guaranteeing that a family would continue on. But it wasn't God's answer. It wasn't God's design. As John and I have taken some time to study and to work through this passage, some of our friends came to mind who understand the challenges and the heartache of infertility. So a dear friend of mine named Tina took some time to write out from her experience what it might have been like for Sarai to be in this position and why maybe she came up with this plan. And I'd like to share a version of that with you. God, do you hear me? Do you really see me? It's been 10 long years of waiting. 10 long years of silence. Each month I pray and I wonder and I hope maybe this time I have tried so hard to hold on to your promise that you gave to my beloved Abram. A son, a multitude of sons. But is this promise not for me too? Am I not to join my husband in your plan? God, why do you restrain me from this blessing? I only give birth to a multitude of tears. They are companions to my broken heart and my empty womb. How can I bear this heartache much longer? To hope any longer makes me weary. Do you hear me? The women around me continue to birth babies, baby after baby. I feel so much anger, rage, shame for this broken body of mine. I can't resist the jealousy and the contempt that fills me. How do I celebrate these births around me? I don't want to. I don't want to hear their cries, only to be reminded my arms are still empty. God, I cried out to you. When will it be my turn? Why them and not me? How is it my love for a child consumes me? I fear that Abram must surely regret taking me as his wife. After all, I failed. What do I have left to give to him? What is my place in this promise of yours? Abram insists that you are faithful and that he heard what he heard from you. But really? Did he? God, why can't you speak to me? Perhaps this whole thing is just a fantasy. Perhaps my part is done and it is time for me to just step aside and release my love to another who can fulfill this need. I can't even bear the thought, yet I can't bear the fault of a promise unfulfilled because of me. God, I cry out to you over and over. When will it be my turn? Why them, not me? How is it that my love for a child consumes me? I am weary. I am tired. I am done. I can't continue this way. My heart and my soul are crushed. I cannot hope for the impossible any longer. I cannot wait for magic or miracles, whatever it be. It's foolish. It's foolish to hope for this old body and broken womb to ever be home to a child. Instead, I'll give my beloved another, Hagar. Surely she might do what I cannot. She might give what I cannot. She might bear a son, the fulfillment of your promise. Perhaps then, this might release me from my guilt and my shame. Perhaps then this is your plan and means of blessing all along.
It's hard to hear as you read it. As someone who, Tina, and our friend, she is not able to have children. And this was her putting herself in Sarai's shoes a little bit. And what it must have been like for her to wrestle in those moments of what is going on here. You've made this promise. Your design is clear. The vision you've given is clear. But the plan and how to act that out isn't. And so what did she do? What was she to do? She was in this tension point. She was in this God-sized problem of childlessness that she didn't know what to do with. Now, what was God doing potentially in her heart? Because this was something that God set up. We've got to be honest about this. God is able to heal that kind of stuff. But what is God's intention for allowing us to go through some of these kind of things? Well, I think one of the things that she had to wrestle through was her own self-perception. That at that time, her identity was interwoven with childbearing. She was known as a woman. You were only known as a woman if you could bear a child. And in this passage, it even seems to indicate in the Hebrew that what she was trying to do was grow a family, as in her and Abram and even Lot to a degree early on were not really a family because they didn't have that third part. They didn't have the child. And so she felt a ton of shame in her life for not being able to do that. Now, was that her fault? Obviously not. That was some sort of something that God was allowing in her life that he was calling to her through, even in that hard time. Now, she could have easily seen this plan with Hagar to be an act of love and surrender. Right? She could have said, I'm willing to even surrender my love for Abram into somebody else's arms. But what does that do to your self-perception when you think that God's plan is for you to release the person that is most vital to you, that you love the most? So I think God is trying to work on her self-perception, but it goes in some weird ways. And it's because of this idea that a woman has to be able to bear children in order to be a woman, and a family has to have children in order to be a family. God was pushing on that a little bit, and she didn't quite respond the way that really he would have wanted.
Proverbs talks about how the waters of the heart are deep waters. And it is likely, like in our lives, God allows shattered dreams, disappointment, or long periods of waiting where we're not even really sure the problem will be solved or the pain will be alleviated, to draw up from the deep parts of our heart lies and beliefs about ourselves, about others, and about God that we actually hold on to and don't even realize.
So another thing that God was pushing on with Sarai was her perception of him. You know, God had identified himself as Yahweh, the one true God, the I am that I am, the self-existent one, to Abram, and had called their family from far away into the promised land. But all that time, he had never spoken directly to Sarai. That had to kind of be a challenge for her because God was quiet for her, and yet she was a vital part of God's plan. Why would God be quiet with somebody who the plan is centered around even? Was this God's punishment for her? Was this a curse? You know, in the passage that we had read, it says, Yahweh has restrained me. This is what Sarai says. Yahweh has restrained me from having children. You know, almost this is God's fault. And isn't that what we want to do when we get put into God-sized problems? We want to kind of blame somebody. We want to blame our bodies. We want to blame God. We want to blame the cancer. We want to blame the virus. We want to blame decisions that other people make that we don't have any control over. We want to blame something. And yet, it's not there to do. So why would God be silent to Sarai when he actually wants her to communicate with him? And that's a hard challenge there. It's almost like God is ushering her in by his silence. It's like God is saying, come, talk to me, Sarai. I want a relationship with you. I want you to come to me as father, as a lover, as what you think Abram is to you, I want to be to you. And then it's got to be really hard for Sarai to hear that when Hagar comes back from her runaway, then she says, hey, Yahweh's talked to me too. And he's promised me that the baby inside me, Ishmael, God sees is going to be this great nation. And it looks like the plan worked, at least at that point. But Sarai's left here still with open hands. She still has no baby, and she still has no conversation with God. And now you've talked to Abram, and you've talked to Hagar, but you still haven't talked to me. This is pushing on Sarah's perception of God. Who are you, God? And what do you want with me? And we're going to see that in a couple weeks when she actually gets pregnant and she starts laughing when she's told that she's going to get pregnant. And it's that kind of like, I just can't believe this. But isn't that what God-sized problems do to us? They cause us to wrestle with God in ways that unearth those things, like you were saying, that are maybe even unknown to us. And I think that's what God was really wanting to get with Sarai.
We know that God was with Sarai all along. But when you're in the waiting and in the silence, and we have to remember this is 10 long years. When you're in the waiting and in the silence, like Sarai, you're vulnerable. You're vulnerable to lose faith and to lose hope. Proverbs talks about how hope that is deferred makes the heart grow sick. You can imagine, even from this writing that I shared from Tina's heart, Sarai must have grown very weary and hopeless. To survive in the waiting, when you're wanting and dreaming of a child or of a spouse or of healing, there comes a time when you actually have to survive, let it go. Almost resign and grieve that dream. Otherwise, it grows very wearisome.
It's very heavy on us.
And the truth is, as any of us age, there is a longing that we all have for our lives to have meaning and impact beyond our life and to leave a legacy. Sarah's at this place of, she's older. Her womb is not healed, and a legacy coming from her looks impossible, hopeless. And if you can imagine in the daily, in the mundane, day after day, the making of the flatbread and the eating and the cleaning up and the waiting, month after month, trying to trust, yet no signs of healing, no signs of a child, no signs of a son. There were probably countless conversations that Abraham and Sarah shared, wondering, should we do something different? Should we try to do something different? And still no hope. This was Sarai's way, in a very vulnerable place, to take a God-sized problem and bring her own solution.
So there are a couple things that we can do when we face God-sized problems. And we came up with 4 of them. That God-sized problems, when we encounter them, that God can promise and provide a solution. Right? This is Moses at the Red Sea. That he came upon a God-sized problem. The armies were behind him and the sea was in front of him and he was going to get wiped out. He called upon God, split the sea, the nation was saved. That happens, and we want to worship God. And the first thing Moses did after the Red Sea was write a poem about praising God and worshiping God, because God came through in a very real and awesome way. And there are times where God will do that, where he will promise and he'll provide the solution. And that's really amazing. We want to worship God and celebrate after those times. The second thing we could think of was that God invites us then, when we encounter a God-sized problem, to partner with him in a solution. This was maybe similar to Gideon when he's trying to get an army together to fight the Midianites. With Gideon, God says, well, go do that, but I want you to limit your army. I want you to still take action, but I want you to do it in my way. And Gideon did that, and it worked, and there was a real release of the people when Gideon did that. You know, when we take action, God asks us to take action and partner with him. We end up feeling empowered. We end up feeling like we know we can trust God. And again, we're going into celebration and worship. Now, there is a third way that we can do here, but sometimes God asks us to do when, well, that God doesn't ask us to do when we encounter a God-sized problem. And that's we take action on our own and we make a mess. That's exactly what Sarai did in this story, is she did what the culture said to do, and it really backfired on her. And there was a lot of relational discord, and we still feel the effects of that today. Now, that brings crisis. When we try to do our own way, when we take our own path, not God's, it's always going to bring crisis. But hopefully we respond in that situation in confession, in cleanup, and it ends up in intimacy with God. But there is a fourth way that may be the hardest of the bunch.
Absolutely. And many of us have been in this fourth way. This is when God invites us to wait. It's this tension of a lack of clarity on how much to do, how much to act, in fact, to do nothing other than to be faithful in the waiting. And this is much like Paul with the thorn in his flesh as he waited in this lifetime, that thorn never being removed. Many of us know this type of waiting. It's the waiting for the healing, or the waiting for your partner, the waiting for your child. God invites us to wait, to trust, to have faith. And sometimes he provides and sometimes he doesn't. And he wants us to wait.
And he wants us to wait because there's something that he wants to show us in that moment. Or there's something that he wants to show us about ourselves in that moment. So the waiting becomes an invitation to relationship that Sarai is going to respond to eventually, but it's going to be an even longer period of time. So when we connect in our Connect groups this week, we're going to talk about what it feels like to be in those tension points of the waiting. How are we going to do this where we can still cling to God and grow our relationship with him and yet struggle in what feels like maybe a hopeless situation or a helpless situation? See, we need community when those kind of things come. We need somebody to blow wind in our sails to help us point us in the right direction too. And that's what these groups are. So we hope you will discuss this in community after you hear this, and that God will become more intimate to you even as we wait. But thank you for joining us this morning. Blessings.